Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustance, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Hi, everybody. It's Barry Eustance here from the Success Consultancy with the Just Great People podcast. Really delighted to introduce you to Francis Wade from Framework Consulting in Kingston, Jamaica. Again, I'll explain where Francis and I met, but Francis, again, has got a great story and also great perspective on strategy and particularly long-term strategy. But I'm going to let Francis lead you into that journey. And again, as usual, I'll just sit in the corner and try and think of some intelligent questions. So, Francis, welcome to the Just Great People podcast. Please,
thanks, Barry.
Give a bit of background. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, as folks can tell, I have a bit of an accent because I was raised here in Kingston, Jamaica. I, however, lived in the US for 21 years and then came back, returned to Jamaica in 2005, and I've been here more or less ever since. And my company focuses on strategic planning, and we've done retreats for the better part of 23 years or so, all of which are of a long-term nature. So we typically look at 15 to 30 years out, and that's what we do.
And when you say long-term, you don't mean long-term retreats. All the retreats actually focus on long-term strategy.
Right. Our retreats are 2 or 3 days, and the time frame is 15 to 30 years, thankfully.
And I think for anybody who perhaps haven't been or hasn't been acquainted with long-term strategic thinking and long-term strategy, it may come as a bit of a shock. You go, well, how can you get past? The most I can think out to is 3 years. Your perspective, I think, will enlighten people, and I'll hand you back, Francis, to answer that question, because it's one that I think may surprise people about how thinking long-term actually plays back into shorter-term strategy and thinking.
Right. Well, let's start a bit by looking at the problem that we're trying to solve. The problem that is not that people have strategies that are too short per se. It's that they're too small. This is a matter of aspiration. It's a problem of wanting too little. And what's happened over the past, it's actually a long-term trend, 30 years, 40 years, is that managers have not wanted big things to happen. They've not been committed to game-changing results. Consequently, they end up thinking about, what can I get away with, before I'm kicked out. If I'm a CEO, my average tenure is 4 or 5 years. So, they get on a quarterly call, maybe with some investors, and the investors want to know, what are you doing for us this month or this quarter or this year? And what's happened over time is that leaders have lost the commitment that only a few do to create long-term value. So once you get committed to creating long-term value, you start getting interested in game-changing strategy. And once you start getting interested in game-changing strategy, then it's no longer a matter of 2 or 3 years. Then you have to think, you have to actually think, as opposed to just react to what's happening in the space at the moment. So long story short, it's not really about long-term thinking or strategy. It's really about game-changing strategy or game-changing results. And the fact is, you can't squeeze those into 2 or 3 years.
And so how do you open the discussion with people when they come to your retreats, thinking in terms of the smaller problem solving? How do you get over that kind of embedded groupthink for short-termism? How do you replace that with the bigger vision and the inevitably longer time frame and strategic thinking that implies?
Yeah. Well, folks who come into our retreats, by then we've done some brainwashing. So we've had contact with them, in different ways before they actually walk in. So they're walking in already thinking that there's something going to be different about this one. This is going to, as I said, be game-changing in some way. We just don't know how to do it, left to our own devices. Because most executive teams, they have a Monday morning meeting, and what they're looking at is all the things that went wrong last week and how to fix them. So they have these conversations that are really about immediate problems and immediate surprises, and usually don't require everybody doesn't have to be there to discuss every problem, but their habitual focus is short term. So when they meet us, we point this out and we say, you could be on a treadmill forever of chasing down these short-term results and short-term solutions. And if you want to, that's perfectly fine. If if you want to continue playing that game forever, then good on you. If they start to say, well, maybe not, these things actually have deeper causes, and because of that, they don't have easy solutions that you could just put in place and implement on a short time frame, then we say, good, well, maybe a long-term strategy, a game-changing strategy is really what you should be looking at. It's just that you just don't know how to do it. And we can take you through the process of doing the thinking for yourself. We'll just guide you through the process. So by the time they walk into the retreat, they've already bought it and they've already paid us something. So we know that, we can get paid. So
always very important.
Always very important. That first invoice. But we've already contracted with them and they've already agreed. And we've started to point out. So we ask a bunch of sort of very nosy questions, such as, what are some of the problems that you wish prior senior management teams should have solved? What are some of the things you think they should have looked at? And then they go to town because they have this long list of things that they're now dealing with because a prior executive team or a prior board or some prior body was lazy or short-term or whatever the pejorative is. They know that they didn't get the job done, and that's why we're trying to fix it today. So we asked that question before the retreat. So they already have this idea that the problems that we have today don't have their roots in decisions we made yesterday. They have their roots in decisions made 10 years ago. So they, Barry, I can't help but think of airlines when I look at you. When I'm with you, I should say. When I see your face, I think of you in the cockpit.
Yeah.
And Southwest Airlines is a great example because they brought down the entire system a couple of years ago, 2 years or 3 years ago. And all that happened was that they had some ice on the wings of some planes. Well, yeah, but this was not an icing problem. This was a software problem. That the software solutions they were using were stale and outdated and should have been put in place, should have been replaced some 15, 20 years before, but they persisted in making minimal investments and band-aids to the software systems that they had. And by refusing to update them, by refusing to take a long-term perspective, they made a number of short-term decisions, and successive leadership teams said, well, what can we get away with this year? And they kept saying that for 20 years to the point where they destroyed millions of dollars of value. They went from being highly respected to now being, they're barely, I think they're making losses for the first time in their history. Yeah. And they used to be the industry leader, but they were hiding a problem with their short-term thinking. And the problem manifested itself, came to a head when they had this icing problem a couple of years ago that brought down the entire world's network of airlines. So we give stories like that to motivate people to think.
I'm sure they're very common, not just in the airline industry, but the short-term thinking. How long? What do I want to come in? What will my legacy be when I leave? And then I'm moving on to the next assignment or retirement. Presumably,
let me add to the legacy business, because we have a peculiar way of doing that also. So in our retreats, we like to pick out the youngest person in the room, and we say, we ask the question, who's the youngest person that we have here today? And some 20-something-year-old will raise their hand, or they get picked on. They're usually trying to hide because, they're a small fry in a big pond. And we say, imagine everyone that in 20 years' time, this person let's say her name is Amanda. Amanda is the CEO, and she's in a meeting just like this one in 20 years' time. And she's reporting what it was like to be in this meeting today, 2024. And she's telling them one of two stories. So one story she could be telling them is, guys, you won't believe what happened 20 years ago, where they made these courageous decisions. They made a long-term commitment. It was so selfless what they did. And today we're benefiting from the decisions that they made. So all the success that we have today is because of the hard decisions and the difficult conversations that they had 20 years ago. And I happen to be there for it. So that's one possible story. The other story is that she's shaking her head and saying, it was terrible. They kicked the can down the road and they made things worse. And they persisted in the usual business as usual, short-term thinking. And all they cared about was their pensions and their getting their stock options vested. And they gave in to the pressure from hedge funds. And today we're suffering because they didn't make the hard decisions they needed to make back in 2024. So we say, you have a choice. Are you going to do something that's going to be game-changing, that may be remembered? Or are you going to follow business as usual practices and stick to the short term and, really just take the easy way out and have this be another version of your Monday morning meeting, just a little longer?
That was actually going to be my next question. And interestingly, my ears really pricked up when we were in Strat Chat chatting, and that's where Francis and I met. And you described, so you've got the range of ages, the demographics and the ages in the room. And you described something magical happening, which I'll leave you to explain, and when that magic occurs and how it occurs, because I think it's inspirational and very enlightening. It certainly was for me.
Magic are you thinking of in particular?
Yeah,
all magic, but
all magic. No, I'm going to help Francis here, because it's basically when people are thinking long term, their short term perspective changes, and it's kind of that magic that is you were alluding to, and I think when I heard it, it suddenly it all pinged in my head exactly how all this hangs together.
Right. Okay, so the average executive team has a hard time thinking about 15 to 30 years old. You're absolutely right. They've been fed a steady diet of short-term results, and they've gotten promoted to the C-suite because of their short-term results ability, their ability to produce measurable results. And that's why they are where they are. So they've gotten this thing honed. So they believe that they are the top of their game, and they just need to continue doing what they were doing. And along we come, and then we start to say, well, truth is, if you think long-term, you can do these very big things. And you can start to implement them right away once you start to think long and big. But you got to think long and big first before you start thinking of what to do about these things today. Now, people don't see that, and they don't trust us, frankly. when we start the conversation, they think they're going to be taken all the way around the mulberry bush and end up with something that looks like Star Wars or Star Trek, or something that looks so futuristic that it has nothing to do with where they are today. But by the end of the process, they're able to see that long-term decisions actually get shaped by short-term actions. They're actually one and the same. So we're not offering them anything that's disconnected. It's single narrative. It's just that they've gotten into the habit of essentially saying, we'll focus on 1 to 4 years, and everything from 5 years beyond we'll ignore. And like Southwest Airlines, we'll just assume that's a future generations to solve. Good luck to them, but we'll focus on the part that we care about. And once they get broken out of that mold, just enough to try the exercise, which is, let's pick a target year. So I should probably say that before they do that, we have them do an in-depth diagnosis of where they are today. Then they pick a target year, and that's 15 to 30 years old, sometimes longer. sometimes shorter, but it's out there. Then they start to create or envision what that target year could look like. They do a version of scenario planning. It's called scenario planning. We have them choose one scenario or one group of scenarios for that target year, and then we have them do what's called backcasting. No, I've just about never, in 60-something retreats, I've never seen a team know what we're talking about when we say backcasting. And they may have read it in a book, found it on the internet, but they've never actually done it. When you actually do it, though, you stand in the target year and you work your way back to the present. And that working your way back to the present so there's some magical things that do happen. For example, you realize that there are things that you're focused on today that are actually irrelevant because they're going to disappear. Because given a long-term point of view and long-term strategy, you actually need to stop focusing on certain things. You need to withdraw your commitment. You need to take money away, take people away, allow products to die. You need to do these things that don't make sense in the short term. But in the long term, they make perfect sense. You need to invest in technologies that today people don't even know what they are. AI, what? They don't make any sense in today's thinking. But in the long term, they make perfect sense. And you'll see that it's easy for, once they start doing the exercise, they start to agree that, yes, something like AI is going to have a huge impact. And we need to pave the way for that. And today, how many people in our company know anything about AI? And then you see like one hand go up, or we know one guy somewhere in IT who knows something. It's okay. Well, today you need to invest in that at scale. And how do you go about doing that? So that's your short-term plan. We had one company, to give a counterexample to that said, we need to enter Latin America in a big way. And to do that, we need to have a bilingual workforce. And they had about 3,000 employees, let's say. And they said, okay, well, 15, 20 years should be enough to, become bilingual, right? To have a bilingual workforce. Well, turns out, which was a surprise to me, that when you do the backcasting from a bilingual company all the way to where you are today, you can't get there in 15, 20 years for a company of 3,000. It turns out to be a wicked problem. So when they came back and said, when you actually run the numbers, it's not possible. Even if we fire everyone and hire a bunch of bilingual speakers, we have to move our headquarters to a different country soon if we're going to hope to even accomplish.
That was a function of backcasting, specifically a function of backcasting.
Yeah, it's a function of backcasting. Yeah. So this often happens is that what seems to be a reasonable aspiration, seems to be a decent goal, turns out to be nonsense. Because when you backcast the numbers, there's no business plan. There's no force on earth that can force people to learn another language. So they actually had to give up the core of their strategy and not go into Latin America the way they wanted to. They had to scale it all the way back because there was just no way to accomplish the goals that they wanted to accomplish, given the limits to language learning. And as they were reporting it, because we have them do the backcasting on their own in a small team without our involvement. Part of it so that we can be one of the recipients as if we're hearing it for the first time, which we are. So I was shocked to hear this because I along with it sounds easy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But that's a bit of the magic of making a big commitment and then using some rigor via this process of backcasting in order to create a feasible pathway to get from where you are today to any future that you want.
And how do you facilitate that backcasting? I mean, you must presumably have some resistance to it, Francis, initially, or are people sufficiently engaged by that stage to really slide into it easily? I mean, how do you facilitate that process in something as short as 3 days? And then how do you keep it rolling?
2 days.
2 days. Right.
I wish I could say that we use, some fancy technique, but as I said, by the time by the time we start with them on the first day, they've already bought into some degree what we're doing. We show them a case study to show what happens. I tell stories like the Spanish-speaking story. I tell them that their last strategic plan was probably a wish list of all these great things, but because they didn't do any backcasting, or in other words, to follow Peter Campo's lead, because they didn't address the bottlenecks and make decisions, which you have to do when you're backcasting, by the way. The two are actually, you do both at the same time. Therefore, your last strategic plan, because it was nothing more than a wish list, had no credibility. And everyone walked out of that room saying how nice that is. Let me ignore it for another year or two because it's not going to happen anyway. It's way out there. We don't have the capacity and nobody really believes that we do, so let's all ignore it. And then they come back the following year. What happened though? I don't know. All right, well, let's do it again. And unfortunately, that's the cycle that they fall into. So we point out that wish lists don't work.
Just to interject, Francis, just for our dear listener and viewer, Peter Campo, if you haven't come across Peter's work, Peter Campo has written The Emergent Approach to Strategy. We'll put the link on the website here. We speak with Peter on a regular basis. And The Emergent Approach to Strategy, we'll give it a shout out here, is extremely helpful for anybody contemplating strategy, both in the short term and the longer term. So back to you, Francis. Thank you.
Right. So we show them the example and say that if you want to have these tough conversations and actually have a long-term strategy that's feasible and credible, then we give them the tools to do this backcasting, and we say it'll take a couple of hours. Sometimes it takes 4 hours, but we actually leave them to do it at the end of the first day usually. And then they report the results at the beginning of the second day. And so that's another bit of magic that happens, because what they come back with, by then they're like sweating and they look exhausted because they've been up late. They've been fighting because there's some contentious points of view that need to be resolved, but they're at least unified. So this is a small team from the bigger team, usually 5 people out of a retreat of 20. And as they present, they're offering up this narrative. And as they're doing it, the rest of the team is saying, no, you can't do that. No, that part is wrong. So it's being changed on the fly because they're saying, oh, but we were so tired and, we didn't have the guy from IT with us and he's now telling us we can't do that, or we didn't have this. So it's changed in the moment. But what results is that after a couple of hours of conversation on that second day is that 20 people now agree on a 30-year strategy. And going from when they believed that it wasn't even possible to put one together, they know they don't even see the value. They are talking about the value. And
Right.
They're asking, how do we get this out to our people? How do we turn this into short-term projects? And we take them through the next steps, which is to develop short-term projects.
So it's feeding all the way back from that long-term view into the shorter-term strategies to achieve the long-term view. So there's a unified strategy that runs them all the way through and is supported by the shorter-term strategies that are then built to support that long-term vision. Is that how it works, Francis?
Right. Yeah, think of it as one narrative. It's really one narrative. It's just that it's a longer narrative than they've ever seen before. But the good news is that a longer narrative allows you to reach for game-changing results and inspiring results and, industry-changing, category-creating kinds of commitments. It just allows you to dream way bigger than you can if you're just looking at the short term. That's the part that really surprises them, because they would have individually dreamed of these things, or they would complain that these things aren't happening, or that what we really should be doing is looking to take over the industry with our new technology. But even the technology companies that I worked with, because they're not thinking far out enough, their aspirations tend to be small. And even then, they're sitting on amazing technology. But if you don't play it out and think, what's the long-term implications of this technology? If we take it to its extreme, 30 years, then they don't even get inspired by it, which is really sad, you know?
We were in a conversation earlier today, dear listener, and viewer, about products that are going to be basically not around in 10 years' time. And I would guess, Francis, that the long-term strategic view, the long-term game plan starts to really trigger that kind of thinking. What is the reality going to look like, and how do we build to it from here?
That's a it's a hard conversation for those who are wedded emotionally to their current product. It's a hard thing to say, ask them, okay, we get that it's your number one product, it's producing all this marginal, high margins, and it's creating net revenue, it's amazing, profitable, and when will it die? So, anyway, it's going to die at some point. What year? And we hear someone says 3 years, and someone says, no, 15 years. And we say, okay, well, somewhere in here, there's a number that we need to work with, right? Because you need to plan for it. So what's the right number? And they have they then have a very difficult conversation about when is the life cycle, the profit cycle of this product going to end, and which then has implications for when we introduce our new products or our new iteration or the new technology. Not easy conversations to have, but if this team isn't going to have them, then who will?
Yeah, exactly. Critically important conversations. And potentially the conversations that not only will ensure that the organization survives in the long term, but actually thrives in that period because of the particular dynamics of the room. When you have this age difference, do you see that the older people in the room who may be coasting towards retirement and coasting towards a life on the beach, do you suddenly see them engaging and suddenly taking a different perspective, developing a different perspective?
Yeah, it might sound, a bit, I don't know, maybe I'm being too optimistic because I'm not looking into people's heads to know exactly where they are. But I would say that I've never seen real resistance, like almost never. That once the team starts to think in this way, anybody who has doubts, you kind of get swept up. Because what are you going to argue for? Oh, no, I think we should stick to just short-term thinking. It's a hard argument to make,
Yes, exactly.
Once you're assured that we will exit this exercise with a short-term plan, guided by long-term commitments. Once you get that, then, kind of the resistance goes away and say, well, what am I going to argue for? That we don't have long-term commitments? No, nobody. So usually the team is thinking together as one in terms of what it wants as the output. So really our job then switches from, we don't spend much time convincing. We spend more time helping them get through the really difficult spots, like the one I mentioned about the 3 versus the 13 years. So our energy is spent trying to get them through these sort of very, very hard conversations so they can get to commitments.
Well, folks, I was going to ask Francis to give advice to anybody who wanted to think about long-term strategy, but he's just done it. For which I thank you, Francis. It's fantastic. You'll see now why I was so energized by it, and why I think you should all get in touch with Francis. I'll make sure Francis's framework consulting link is in the notes to this podcast. I'll also ensure that the link to Peter Compo's Emergent Approaches Strategies in there. Francis, you've been fantastic. I know that you'll come back and take us through the next step. Francis also runs the Long-Term Strategy Conference, which he runs every year. Be there. We'll get some of that information out to you as well. Francis, thank you very, very much. It's been really insightful. I'm sure our listener and viewers will be thinking long-term and developing those short-term journeys to get there very, very soon. So thank you very much, Francis Wade from Framework Consulting. Thank you.
Welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And before we go, just a reminder, please do like, do share, and please do subscribe to this podcast and ensure that you pass it on to everybody you know. So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.